Welcome back to our conversation about World War One. So what you can see in front of you is a map you haven't seen yet, but we did talk last week about the Western Front um, of World War One. So some of the terms we used last week was the Schlieffen plans. Once the assassination occurred and Germany and Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire decided that a two-front war is something that they had to be concerned about, they came up with the Schlieffen plan. And the Schlieffen plan was going to hold the Russians off while they focused their time and energy on toppling France. Okay, so hopefully that sounds familiar to you because that is what our conversation was like. Let me see if I can get a pin up here. Good. So one more time, the Schlieffen plan was to hold the Eastern Front off, hold this off with just enough troops to get by and to focus time and energy over here on the Western Front. Okay. We also talked about the fact that the Western Front became just a stalemate with a war of attrition settling into trench warfare. And a war of attrition meant that neither side was really gaining much ground. And in fact, loss of life was extremely heavy. And we left off having written all of this screen, but at the bottom, there were a series of wars or battles at the bottom that I didn't explain. And so there are all kinds of battles that get fought along the Western Front of World War I. But there are a couple that I would like you to know about because I think they represent something significant. So first of all, the Battle of the Marne, it happens early on. And the reason that I would say the Battle of Marne is significant is because if you remember, the Schlieffen plan was to topple France in just a matter of weeks. But at the Battle of Marne, it was the first time that the German advance was turned around. So they became aware that their initial plan was not going to work. The Battle of Marne started in September, early September, like September 6th. It lasted for 4 days. And it was the first time that the Central Powers advance was stopped. One of the ways that they stopped that advance was the French made use of the privatization of taxis. They elicited the help of about 2,000 French taxis to hurriedly scurry new men to the front lines because the losses were so great. They didn't anticipate the losses were going to be that great, and they were scrambling to get new troops into place. So 2,000 taxi drivers kind of saved the day at the Battle of Marne. The Battle of Marne is also a good example of a battle to know about because there are repeat battles fought there. So when we talked about a war of attrition, meaning that there was kind of a futile nature, meaning that it became kind of useless. The Battle of Marne is a good example of that because they fight a first Battle of the Marne, they fight a second Battle of the Marne, and I do believe they even fight a third. One of the other significant battles along the Western Front that I would like you to at least recognize the name of is the Battle of the Somme. Somme is a river in France, and so the battle is named after the river next to which the battle was fought. The Battle of Somme lasts from July through November of 1916. And the reason that it is significant is because it's a great representation. It's a horrible representation, actually, of the futile nature of how deadly trench warfare would be. On one single day, with just one Allied troop count, 57,000 British casualties in one single day of the Battle of the Somme. 57,000 on just one day, 20,000 killed, just British men in one single day. And that goes on for months. So this idea of like what kind of death toll we could mount over Western Front and trench warfare battles, it made the whole world aware that we were going to face significant losses if we just chose to fight this way. Last but not least, the Battle of Verdun, and this is not to take anything away from all those other horrible battles that get fought, but the Battle of Verdun is significant because more than 700,000 men die at the Battle of Verdun, and they fight that battle for 10 months. 10 months. And I think the Battle of Verdun, that was one of the battles that was coming toward the midway through the war, and it just became apparent that replacing the losses, those kind of losses, it wasn't sustainable. It wasn't something that both sides were able to do indefinitely. Luckily for the Allies, they convinced the United States to kind of come on board in 1917, and that replenishes their supplies to a degree. But the Central Powers, they don't have a huge military force that's coming on board late in the war. Okay, so I'm using this map just to make sure that you can see the Battle of Verdun that we just talked about, the Battle of Somme, and the battles of Marne, all along this Western Front. Okay, this right here, this chart is the casualties at just the Battle of Somme. Okay. Another thing that I want you to be thinking about are these new weapons of war. One of the reasons that the World War I was so deadly was because we were using that old trench system, but we were introducing these new weapons of war. This is not a complete list of all the new additions. And I would argue it's leaving off a really significant addition of planes. Planes made a huge difference in this war because you could fly overhead and survey what was happening on the other side. You could also drop bombs from the air and trenches, and it just made like a horrible combination in which you could drop a bomb load into a trench and just have people right there kind of captured in that trench. So planes don't even make the list here, but significant by the end of World War I. The use of them really changed the nature of warfare. A couple of others at the Battle of Ypres, for the first time, poisonous gas was used. Poison gas was used by both sides during the war, so people like to argue about who used it first and how horrible it was. There were about three different types of poisonous gas kind of categories that were used. There were like blistering agents. There were what amounts to kind of tear gas agents, and there were asphyxiants. But poison gas was really frightening. I think it didn't kill as many people as the fear that it elicited. It's psychologically damaging because it was a silent killer or something silent, a silent enemy that you could walk into. It was also difficult to control. Some of the early attempts to use poison gas ended up backfiring on the troops that used them because the wind would shift. They would launch a canister of poison gas, and then the wind would shift, and they'd end up, the gas would come back upon their own men. So this poison gas was a really fearful psychological weapon of war. Machine guns weren't created for the first time during World War I, but they get perfected and utilized in massive numbers. And so the death toll largely significant due to advances of the machine gun and the availability of all men to have a machine gun. Tanks made their debut. I think the British were the very first to use a 4-mile-per-hour tank. They were designed to be able to move people through no man's land. But the first of them were really kind of ineffective, and they got high centered in the big trenches. But by the end of the war, there were significant advancements in tanks, and the steel hulls of tanks had the bullets kind of bouncing off of them, and of course, a heavy firepower coming from the top. Finally, submarines kind of guerrilla war campaigns used out at sea. There was unrestricted submarine warfare, which means people weren't giving any warning and they were sinking vessels and no one could see the enemy coming. And so unrestricted submarine warfare. So launching torpedoes at boats and giving the boats no warning to get people into life rafts or something like that was also part of what led to a really deadly war. Okay, a couple of new things we're going to talk about today in some detail and for your notes. World War I was much more than a European conflict. Australia and Japan, for example, entered the war on the Allies' side, while India supplied troops to fight alongside their British rulers. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Turks and later Bulgaria allied themselves with Germany and the Central Powers, and as the war promised to be a grim, drawn-out affair, all the great powers looked for other allies around the globe to help tip the balance. They also sought new war fronts on which to achieve victory. So, as the war drug on, the main combatants looked beyond Europe for a way to end the stalemate. However, none of the alliances they formed or the new battlefronts that they opened did much to really end the slow and really grinding kind of conflict. One of those kind of more global efforts that was operating outside of that Western Front and the Eastern Front was something called the Gallipoli Campaign. A promising strategy for the Allies seemed to be to attack a region in the Ottoman Empire known as the Dardanelles. So, the reason that they wanted to attack this area right in here, if you look at this map on the top right, I'm wiggling my mouse, right in this Dardanelles region, is because many of the Allies thought if they could cut, like Germany and Austria Hungary, away from the Ottomans, that maybe they could weaken them and kind of weaken the Central Powers more quickly. Plus, of course, this is a water route that is strategically really important. So, by securing the Dardanelles, the Allies believed they could take Constantinople, defeat the Turks, and establish a supply line between the rest of the Allied powers and Russia. So the effort to take the Dardanelles Strait began in February of 1915. It was known as the Gallipoli Campaign, and the British, Australian, New Zealand, and French troops made repeated assaults on the Gallipoli Peninsula on the western side of the strait. British, Australian, New Zealand, and French troops made those assaults. Turkish troops, some commanded by German officers, vigorously defended the region, and by May, Gallipoli had turned into another bloody stalemate. Both sides had dug trenches from which they battled for the rest of the year. In December, the Allies gave up the campaign and began to evacuate, and they had suffered about 250,000 casualties before that happened. In various parts of Asia and Africa, Germany's colonial possessions also came under assault. The Japanese quickly overran German outposts in China. They also captured Germany's Pacific Island colonies. The English and the French troops attacked Germany's 4 African possessions and seized control of 3 of the 4. Elsewhere, in Asia and Africa, the British and French recruited subjects in their colonies for the struggle. Fighting troops as well as laborers came from India, from South Africa, from Senegal and Egypt, Algeria, and from Indochina, which Indochina is Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam today. Many fought and died on the battlefield. Others worked to keep the front lines supplied. To be sure, some colonial subjects wanted nothing to do with their European rulers' conflicts, but others volunteered in hopes that maybe serving would lead to their independence. They could kind of earn the good graces of their colonial masters. This was the view of the Indian political leader Mohandas Gandhi, who supported Indian participation in the war. If we could improve our status through the help and cooperation of the British, he wrote, it was our duty to win their help by standing by them in their hour of need. In 1917, the focus of the war shifted to the high seas. Along the Eastern Front, this red line right here, going back up to that map on the top right, this Eastern Front, hang on just a second. Okay, sorry about that. Now going back to this Eastern Front. So along this red line is the Eastern Front of World War I, and here's a bit about that. So in contrast to the Western Front, the war on the Eastern Front was actually more mobile. The cost in lives, however, was just equally as enormous. So while this entire Eastern Front isn't made up of a trench network, it still has its own deadly nature to it. So at the beginning of the war, the Russian army moved into eastern Germany, but was decisively defeated at the Battle of something called the Tannenberg on August 30th and the Battle of the Mauritian Lakes in September. As a result of these defeats, the Russians were no longer really a threat to actual German territory. However, they were fairly successful at holding their own with their own territory. However, as the war moved on, Russian supply lines were increasingly difficult, and this super cold nature of the winters in Russia made it even more difficult. You guys are familiar with cold Russian winters because we watched Napoleon march into Russia and have significant troubles. Austria-Hungary, Germany's ally, fared less well at first. The Austrians had been defeated by the Russians at Gallica, thrown out of Siberia. To make matters worse, the Italians betrayed the German and Australian allies in the Triple Alliance by attacking Austria in May of 1915. Italy then joined France, Great Britain, and Russia, who had formed the Triple Entente, but now were called the Allied Powers or the Allies. By this time, the Germans had come to the aid of the Austrians, and a German-Austrian army defeated the Russian army at Gallica and pushed the Russians far back into their own territory. Russian casualties stood at about 2.5 million killed, captured, or wounded anyway, and the Russians had almost been knocked completely out of the war. Buoyed by their success, Germany and Austria-Hungary, joined by Bulgaria in September of 1915, attacked and eliminated Serbia from the war, and their success in the East would enable the Germans to move back and be on the offense in the West. Russia has its own revolution. This is when Anastasia and that, if you've ever watched the Anastasia movie, this is when that Russian Revolution occurs. And during that Russian Revolution, Russia decides that it has its own troubles and can't fight in a war at the same time, and it pulls out of the war. So that's a significant kind of advance. Tsar Nicholas of Russia is going to be executed and his entire family, even though there are conspiracy theories out there that say that people survived, in particular the daughter Anastasia. Okay, so with Russia pulling out of the war, all of the central power energy can shift back toward the Western Front, and they are able to push and come within 50 miles of Paris, but still they're held off there. And aren't able to get much further. Okay, the Ed puzzle is going to talk to you more about what this war looked like. You're going to see a particular piece on the Battle of Somme and how deadly that Western Front in this war of attrition really is. Okay, here's a little bit more about the Gallipoli campaign.
Campaign, 1915 to 1916. World War I. By 1915, the war on the Western Front had fallen into a stalemate. The Allied powers fighting in Belgium and France were considering opening a new front. In January 1915, Grand Duke Nicholas of Russia had appealed to Britain for assistance against the Ottoman Empire, a member of the Central Powers which had invaded the Caucasus. A naval expedition was launched by the Allies to capture the Dardanelles Straits, a passage that connects the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara in northwestern Turkey, and beyond that, the Black Sea. If they were successful in their goal, the Allies could link up supply routes with Russia and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. Furthermore, as First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill proposed opening another front would dilute the German forces as they supported the depleting Ottoman Turkish army. British Admiralty Winston Churchill pushed for a naval attack on the Dardanelles with a bombardment by British and French battleships on February the 19th, 1915, and resumed on the 25th because of bad weather. The Ottomans had placed mines in the water, and the minesweepers had failed to detect many of them. The British also sent Royal Marines ashore to sabotage Ottoman artillery. On March the 18th, Allied battleships entered the straits. Fire from the Turks and undetected mines sank 3 of the ships and damaged 3 others. This naval assault could not work because the Turkish guns needed to be silenced, and so did the minefields, which was impossible to do at the same time. The naval ships were also mainly obsolete warships, unsuitable for action. After this failed naval attack, a full-scale amphibious beach assault would begin on the Gallipoli Peninsula. General Ian Hamilton was commander and had assembled 77 ships and 75,000 men. However, he lacked specialist landing craft. Under his command were British forces, ANZAC, standing for Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, and lastly, French troops. The landing started on April 25th. The Allies suffered heavy casualties, establishing the beachheads of Cape Helles and Anzac Cove on the Aegean coast. The Anzac forces had landed a little north of the intended landing site of Garba at a cove instead. The Garba landings would become known as the Anzac Cove landings, in honor of the Australian and New Zealand troops who fought valiantly against the determined Ottoman Turkish defenders. After the landing, the Allies could not progress as trench warfare quickly formed like it had done on the Western Front. The summer heat and the dysentery epidemic were unbearable, and swarms of flies hung around corpses. Hamilton ordered an attack on Suvla Bay in August, involving the landing of 63,000 Allied troops. They were to link up with Anzacs at Anzac Cove and break the stalemate. But indecision meant that the Ottoman Empire would reinforce the position, and by August 10th, an attack led by Mustafa Kemal recaptured Suvla Bay. Allied casualties increased, and the stalemate continued. Reinforcements were lacking. It was time for evacuation. The order to evacuate the Allied troops was given on the 7th of December, with the last troops leaving Suvla Bay and Anzac Cove before dawn on the 20th of December 1915. The last troops left Cape Helles on January the 9th, 1916, and the evacuation was a success with no casualties. The Gallipoli campaign was a disaster for the Allies, who suffered more than 250,000 casualties, while on the Ottoman side, they also had an estimated 250,000 casualties. Gallipoli has become a defining moment in the history of both Australia and New Zealand, and has been recognized as their baptism of fire and a key event to their emergence as independent nations. In Turkey, the battle was seen as a significant event in the foundation of modern Turkey and a final victorious defense before the end of the Ottoman Empire.